Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.23 for our 2023 fundraising campaign. We also have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. Chuck Malkus is a multi-platform storyteller specializing in media, production, TV, and film. His work as an executive producer includes Heist on Netflix, and Chuck's book Full Circle, The Remarkable True Story, is the basis for an Emmy-nominated ESPN documentary. He's the co-founder of Neighbors for Neighbors, an international disaster relief organization, and he's also served as a board member for the American Red Cross, Junior Achievement, and Nova Southeastern University. We talk about all those things and more on this episode of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Chuck Malkus. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Chuck.
Thank you, John.
So let's start at the beginning. What's your backstory?
So I grew up in Miami, initially in Coral Gables and then Westchester. As a youngster in Coral Gables, I had this desire to write. And so I started with the Prado News. I had a little press and I knocked out stories that were taking place in our neighborhood. And then after moving to Westchester, fortunately, at the age of 15, I started out as a volunteer for Miami's community newspapers, where I wrote sports. I dreamed of being a sports writer. Upon attending Christopher Columbus High School in Miami, I had the opportunity to start writing for the Miami News at the age of 16. And I wrote sports. And after doing that, I was a correspondent for 2 years. And then I had intended to attend first Miami-Dade College because I had a full-time sports writing job at the South Dade News Leader, which was a daily newspaper in Homestead. And I did it for a year, and then I went to the University of Kentucky, where I worked in the athletics department in media relations, and I ended up with a Scripps Howard journalism scholarship, and I felt I was on my path as a sports writer. I ended up returning to Miami, where I would be a sports editor at the News Leader, and I was enjoying telling sports stories, but I felt that there was interesting corporate stories to be told from the people who I had met. And I ended up in the PR business. My public relations firm is now 24 years old. I still do some corporate storytelling, but on this journey, I have come across some amazing true life stories that led me into the realization that these stories could be told in documentaries and film.
That was kind of going into my next question is, where did that light bulb go off and say, some of these stories are worthy of, telling in TV or film?
My public relations agency has been located on Las Olas Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale, which is in the heart of the financial district. And since we live in Paradise, I do see along this journey interesting people, unusual events, and frankly, some things which just don't make sense. Call it Florida, call it South Florida. One of the first things that happened that I witnessed was an attorney by the name of Scott Rothstein, who came out of nowhere, became an overnight philanthropist, and started what appeared to be as one of the most successful law firms in Florida. But what I saw the numbers didn't add up. And I started taking notes, and I always felt that one day this would be a story. And the light bulb went off when I was with my wife at the annual Philanthropist of the Year luncheon. And this happens throughout the country, where individuals who are making a difference, both with volunteer time as well as contributions, are recognized and honored. And I was sitting there at a Neighbors for Neighbors table. And at the luncheon, there was a drum roll, and it was time to announce this year's Philanthropist of the Year. And so the band stops and the announcement is made. This year's Philanthropist of the Year is Scott Rothstein. I literally almost fell out of my chair onto the floor, because this is a guy who was never seen in a boardroom, who was never involved with a volunteer effort. All as he did was write checks. As it turned out, the checks he was writing was with stolen money. Mm-hmm. So it became my first story, first Florida story also, of something that was not only unusual, but Rothstein was the country's fourth largest Ponzi by size, but number one with number of co-conspirators, a total of 30. And also, for the first time with a Ponzi, investors received 100% of their money back, just due to the banks who overlooked red flags, and it resulted in all of the money being returned to the investors.
Well, and now also at the same time, you were doing a little bit of location stuff, right?
Yeah, so I became involved with some location management as a result of connectivity with public relations clients. So I sort of became a guy that if you needed access to a location such as a hospital or a sports facility, you would come to me. And so the films that I was involved with were Any Given Sunday, obviously Al Pacino, Cameron Diaz, James Woods. And I helped provide a hospital location, and I helped provide the stadium in Miami. And then another film was the movie Striptease with Demi Moore. And then a third movie was The Substitute with Tom Berenger. And I worked with Leah Sokolowski. Mm-hmm. I worked with the Broward Film Commission. At the time, Elizabeth Wentworth was our commissioner, and we had a volunteer board where I had a title of chairman of the Film Commission, our volunteer organization. So that really lit the fire. It really, for me, was motivation to keep my eyes open and be alert, and hopefully come across some stories which would end up being documentaries and film.
Very cool. And so one of your producing endeavors has been the Netflix series Heist. Tell the audience about your experience with this production.
Certainly. Well, first, the Heist almost didn't get made because it seemed impossible to reach all the individuals on both sides of the law. No one really pursued this story as a documentary or a film. And lo and behold, a volunteer effort I was involved with. I had a career day at Columbus High School and ended up driving down to Miami with a classmate, Scott Rivas, and we're on the road heading south. And I said, Scott, with your career as an FBI agent and a special agent in charge, certainly there's a story that's amazing. And he started out talking about Texas and about a couple cases there. I said, you mean to tell me all this time in Miami, you were not involved with a huge case? He said, oh, well, there was this case at the airport where this money came in every Sunday, and it was somewhere between 80 million and 100 million. And I said, well, please share. He said, I was at a Miami Dolphins football game on a Sunday, and I get this call about this heist at Miami International. He said, I had just ordered a beer. He said, I didn't have a sip of the beer yet, but they wanted me to respond to the airport. And so Scott Rivas, a high school classmate, ended up sharing the rest of the story. I was able to track down the ringleader for the crime. And I began with putting together a book proposal. And I realized at that point, this was such a powerful story that I needed to connect with a major producer, a studio. And so my first contact was, frankly, Netflix. And my agency is a Gersh agency. We felt we'll tell this story as a documentary. And obviously it should be at least 2 episodes. And then after we achieve that, which Heist came out in the summer of 2021, then we'll look towards pursuing a major motion picture. And I do have a script written at this point. There is significant interest, and I'm hoping that by the summer of 2023, that a feature film deal will be finalized.
So I know you've been involved, as we talked about, with a couple of different TV and film projects leading up to that, but this was your first, we'll call it, really high-profile role in the process. What did you learn?
What I learned most important was, because I do nonfiction, is being authentic and looking at the bigger picture, the why, and then the how, and then the unbelievable, for lack of a better word. And it's really those 3 things. As a producer, you start out by having an understanding of what took place. Most important for me is the curiosity of the how and the why. So I felt we captured that with Heist. The Money Plane episodes, as they're known, are number 3 and 4 in Heist. We were able to add reenactments, which made the story even more powerful. And that included, after visiting the airport site, that included having lengthy conversations with a Cuban-American family, a husband and a wife who were desperate to have a child. And after 3 miscarriages, they were hardworking, blue-collar family members. And this was an act of desperation, but one that they felt that they could pull off. And they almost pulled off the heist without a glitch, which is our country's largest airport theft, and a story bigger than Goodfellas.
Wow. And now, we're going to talk a little bit about your book writing as well, but just in general, whether it's TV, film, books, what draws you to a project?
It's a curiosity factor, okay? I think that in storytelling, the most important thing is not only curiosity, but then to ask questions, be alert, and then pursue what others might not know is a bigger story. You may hear of a story, John, and you think, you know what, that's okay, but there's not a whole lot there. The way you determine the rest of the story is to ask further questions, do further research, and speak with anyone and everyone who may have a connection to the story. I think that's so important with nonfiction.
What is fascinating listening to you is it sounds like, we live in the age of immediate gratification, and somebody wants to come up with a concept and write it and execute it and be done in, 6 months. It sounds like some of this takes a really long time for you.
Well, you're right. The quick and the down easy don't work well for our industry today. these projects can take 9 months to a year to structure, to be able to put on paper, and then to go out to market. Okay. Now, for those who feel that they have a story that may get attention by doing something on YouTube, okay, God bless them. But if you want to have a high level of success, it does take the time and effort to put the story together and then to move it to completion.
Now, one of your books is called Full Circle, The Remarkable True Story, and it's the basis for an ESPN Emmy-nominated documentary, Pin Kings. Tell us a bit about the story and how the production came to be.
So this story goes back to Miami in the 70s and the 80s. It's about two high school teammates, both wrestlers, All-American wrestlers at Palmetto High School in Miami. They became best friends. The lightweight goes on to become a DEA agent, okay, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And his best friend, who he was attached to at the hip, the heavyweight, ends up becoming one of the country's largest cocaine kingpins. So it's a story of choices. It's a story of what took place in Miami in the 80s, known as the Miami Vice days.
Mm-hmm.
And it so happens that when they were in high school, I was also in high school as a sports writer for the Miami News. So I knew them then. And then when I went on to work as a full-time sports writer for the Daily South Dade News Leader in Homestead, I was actually covering these two young men as they were seniors in high school. And then they later obviously took two different paths. So the way I reconnected was I knew their story. Everybody knew about Alex DeCubis being a cocaine kingpin. There was stories that came out in newspapers, features. So I reconnected with their coach. And Barry Zimbler, was a friend, somebody that I had worked with over the years. And as a result of that, I ended up going to the prison in downtown Miami where Alex DeCubis was, number one, and interviewed him in prison. And then I connected with the DEA agent, Kevin Pedersen, who had recently retired. And that project I put together as a book proposal and then connected with ESPN. My involvement, it was really important to see this story told where the cocaine kingpin wasn't glorified, number one. Number two, it was important to describe and provide storytelling with Miami in the 80s and the early 90s, also known as the Miami Vice days.
Yeah, those are some days looking back on those. Now, and Chuck, you've been around Florida obviously a number of years. You've been, directly and indirectly involved in the industry for a good portion of that. How have you seen, the production industry change here in Florida through those decades?
Well, I think the way the production industry has changed is it's a little bit more competitive when you have states like Georgia who have great film incentives, and suddenly stories from Florida are getting filmed in other parts of the country. So, that, how do you say, doesn't exactly sit well. But the good news is, I think finally residents, elected officials, and stakeholders are realizing the value of filming in Florida. And they're realizing that certain scenes and locations should be filmed in Florida. And then, John, I think we have leaders in the industry, including yourself, who are determined to turn things around and allow for more incentives to take place and allow for more engagement by our elected officials. So we kind of probably hit a peak in the, let's say, 80s and 90s. And then suddenly there was less being done, less that was being filmed here because of competition. But I think I'm an optimist. I do believe that we will have that opportunity to reach another peak in the very near future.
Good, good. Glad to hear that. And now, what advice do you have for those that are just starting in the business? Where should they start? What's the important things?
The most important thing in starting in this industry is to be present, to be alert, and to understand there is opportunities for connectivity. So let's start with film festivals that take place throughout the state. A film festival is a great way to connect with others, to hear about success stories, and to understand how you may become successful. Another important opportunity, I believe, is that our state universities are offering programming and are offering opportunities, whether it's a speaker, whether it's a film, whether it's a presentation or a class. I'm a strong believer in our university system. I also think it's important, and I'll share an example of going to conferences throughout the country. I was at Real Screen in Dana Point, California in June, and a project that had interest was in fact sold as an unscripted project. I then went that same week in June to the Producers Guild of America, the Produced By conference in LA. And I did have connectivity as well as learning experiences as a result of being there and being present. And then I went to the 25th anniversary of Real Screen in January, and I was able to get a second unscripted series deal. Now, for those starting out in the industry, these are all conferences that you may attend. I mean, I just think it's important to expand your reach and your connectivity by going and participating in events which are a click away from your computer.
Yeah. Well, and those are all events that we encourage people to go to here through Film Florida, and we promote those. And, sometimes, we get pushback and say, well, why are we promoting these conferences out of state? And why are we encouraging people to go there? And then other times people go and say, well, yeah, I didn't get anything out of it. And I think there's a lot of different things you can go there. If you're going there to immediately get that instant gratification, that oftentimes doesn't happen, but it is the start of something that can eventually get there. And I agree with you 100%. I mean, like one of our colleagues, Susan Sims, is constantly saying, you must be present to win. And those are the perfect situations where you can't get what you want if you never show up and you're just, sitting at home waiting for that email to come in. A lot of times those emails don't come in, but you can get those face-to-face conversations there. So that's a great point.
And I'd like to add that by being present, you're able to start conversations, number one. Number two, by being present, you can connect with somebody at the restaurant, at a breakfast, at an evening reception, in the elevator, okay? At a panel discussion. I mean, there's numerous possibilities. And if you're there for 3 or 4 days, it only takes one connection.
Right.
Will open up doors and provide your journey to become reality.
And now a lot of the experiences we've talked about really kind of originated from your PR background. I mean, you're a PR guru. How has that experience helped transition to the film and television side?
I'm a public relations guy at heart. I have been since college. And the transition has taken place by being connected, by being involved in my communities, by serving as a volunteer, by frankly, growing my profile on LinkedIn. On LinkedIn now, I have 25,000 connections. I
Wow.
will tell you that at least 10% of that is related to the film and television industry. But the other 90%, I hear of stories by asking questions and being curious, and finally being present in my community. We're coming out of a tough couple of years with the pandemic, but now I believe there's an appetite, and I'm seeing it at all of these conferences, and I'm seeing it in deals that I have pending, which specifically relate to an appetite for film and television, because our industry, basically was shut down for a couple of years. So
Yeah.
the timing now is better than ever before. There's a demand for content, not to mention the opportunities with streamers. As human beings, we have enjoyed storytelling over the years, and the best stories are those that are impactful. And that's what film and television provides: impactful stories.
And now, Chuck, going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned your involvement with some nonprofits, one of which being Neighbors for Neighbors. Can you touch on your experience with assisting in the aftermath of the variety of natural disasters that we've had here in Florida?
Certainly, and it all begins, John, with being present. I was a member of the Fort Lauderdale JCs as a young guy. Back in 1992, we were known for a raft race that we did on the New River in Fort Lauderdale. Because of that involvement, and CBS 4 was a sponsor, when Hurricane Andrew struck, I received a phone call. CBS 4 lost their television tower. They were off the air, and they had an interest of launching a major rebuilding and relief effort. And they called me asking for a recommendation of how to best achieve that. Would it be with a city, with a county? I said, no, you can't have bureaucracy involved. You need to step outside and away from that. And they said, who would I recommend? And I said, well, the Fort Lauderdale JCs. And so we got together later that day. I'll admit I was at a hurricane party the night before, but I was able to round up the JCs, and we sat around a table. There was the station vice president, general manager, news director, community relations director, and there was 5 of us as JCs. And everybody got excited and said, yes, we need to help. Yes, we need to make a difference. And the president of the JC said, well, we need a chairman who's going to oversee all this. And suddenly, before I knew it, everyone was looking at me. And I said, okay, I'll do it for a month. And that 1 month ended up being 25 years. I was the last remaining original board member. And not only did it provide help in assisting families who lost their homes and individuals who were in tent cities, it provided personal and professional advancements that I could have never, ever dreamed as a young man. And it also provided motivation for understanding the word connectivity and making a difference for others. Fast forward after Hurricane Andrew, the next big natural disaster was Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the Gulf Coast. It was a tragic event. And once again, we sprung into action with what was going to be a Rock for Relief concert to help the victims who, lived in Louisiana, Alabama, the entire Gulf Coast. Okay. And we brought in Gloria Stefan, Queen Latifah, and we had not only an amazing concert experience, but it brought attention to the need. It brought attention to what was necessary to help the poor victims of Hurricane Katrina. And then most recently, we had another hurricane, which every time you see the images from a hurricane or a natural disaster or a family in need, you realize that television and filmmaking provides the most powerful relief efforts. And I can attest to this because with Hurricane Ian, CBS 4 and Miami-Dade County and a couple of nonprofit organizations sprung into action once again, 30 years later from our beginning, and we were able to send much needed food, water, clothing, tents, airbags, sleeping bags, blankets, everything that you can imagine to our west coast of Florida. And after being in Fort Myers and Naples, it's clear that the need is tremendous. And the efforts to help these Florida residents are going to take at least another year or two. The power of television, the power now of social media is able to show the need and the help which is necessary and what so many people are willing to provide.
Yeah. Now, Chuck, where can people keep up on everything you're doing across the board?
Right. I'm a strong believer you focus your efforts on one social channel. So my social channel is LinkedIn. And what I try to share on LinkedIn is not only film success, but also stories and posts about how others can make a difference. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, but there's only so many hours in the day, John.
Yeah, you actually have to do work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Chuck, we've known each other for a few years now. You've always been a great friend to Film Florida as a member, and we really appreciate that. And you're always willing to help out whenever we need anything. So thanks for your continued support, and thanks for taking the time to do the Film Florida podcast with me.
Well, I'd like to thank all the board members of Film Florida, as well as you personally, John. We're in this together. You achieve success through collaborations and connectivity. And I see on the horizon some great things to come for our film industry in Florida.
I hope you're right, and I think you're going to be right, and I appreciate that. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.23 for our 2023 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.